Before they were legends of the silver screen, they were just names on enlistment forms, forgotten uniforms, secret missions. Some fought in shadows, others with scripts and cameras, but all served in a war that reshaped the world. These aren't the roles they're famous for. These are the ones they never auditioned for, and rarely spoke about. From battlefield to backlot, this is the hidden war behind 13 of Britain's brightest stars, and it's not the story you think it is. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more untold stories just like this one. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far this mystery reaches. 1. David Niven. There are two kinds of people in war stories, those who talk and those who don't. David Niven belongs squarely to the latter. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had too much he couldn't. Before he was a household name, before he was charming his way across the screen in The Bishop's Wife, or outwitting Nazis in The Guns of Navarone, Niven had already played a part in something far more obscure and far more dangerous. When World War II broke out, Niven didn't wait for Hollywood's blessing. He packed up, left the warmth of rising fame in America, and re-enlisted in the British Army, like it was just the obvious thing to do. He was placed in the GHQ Liaison Regiment, Phantom, as it was unofficially known, a unit whose job was to shadow the front lines without being seen, to report real-time battlefield intelligence to high command, and to never, ever be caught doing it. The public-facing version of Niven's wartime resume is sparse. Lieutenant Colonel, the press releases say, reconnaissance. It's a clean little phrase that hides the grim mechanics of what Phantom actually did, hopping between units, sneaking across hostile terrain, watching battles unfold like a living telegram, and somehow making it back in time to file a report that might decide the next day's airstrike. Phantom was made up of quiet men who saw too much and said too little. Niven fit right in. But because the unit's operations were designed to be invisible, they left behind a mythological silhouette. Over the decades, people began filling in the gaps. Rumors of clandestine missions, commando raids, midnight dashes behind German lines. None of it confirmed, none of it denied. And Niven, unhelpfully, made a career out of sidestepping those questions. Anyone who says he wasn't scared during the war is a liar, he once said. That's about as confessional as he got. The effect was poetic. A man famous for being in the spotlight spent the war living in its shadows. He came back with a rank, a few medals, and an unbroken vow of silence. Not many details, but plenty of rumors. And sometimes that's all it takes to become a legend. And then there was Alec Guinness, who, unlike Niven, didn't have to be chased by mystery. He brought it with him, in a landing craft full of secrets, and a face no one would expect to find on a battlefield. 2. Sir Alec Guinness. It's hard to picture Obi-Wan Kenobi crashing a landing craft into Sicily under machine gun fire, but reality never asked for your approval. Alec Guinness, long before he became the sage of Star Wars or the tragic soul of the bridge on the River Kwai, was just another newly commissioned officer in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, learning how to keep a boat from exploding. By 1941, Guinness had already dipped his toes into acting fame. But when the war came knocking, he didn't retreat behind a camera. He joined the Navy, trained up, and soon found himself at the helm of a landing craft infantry, essentially a glorified metal shoebox used to fling soldiers onto enemy beaches with all the grace of a thrown brick. He led one of these vessels during the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943. This wasn't desk war or morale work. This was real-deal chaos and bullets warfare. Guinness later described the experience with a tone that would become his trademark: cool, clipped, underwhelmed. The kind of man who could dodge death and then politely ask for a cup of tea. After Sicily, he wasn't done. He went on to ferry equipment and agents to Yugoslav partisans, smuggling supplies and sometimes people, back and forth across a Mediterranean drawn in blood and secrets. And yet, When the war ended and Guinness returned to acting, his service was rarely paraded. There were no dramatic stories told on talk shows, no heroic memoirs ghost-written to settle the score. Perhaps because Guinness always had a complicated relationship with visibility. He once said that acting was a form of hiding in plain sight. The same could be said of his wartime career, dangerous, critical, and entirely outside the spotlight. It's strange, really, because while he went on to play monks, kings, spies, and saboteurs, none of it ever quite matched the surreal truth of what he'd already lived through. His best roles were fiction. His most forgotten role might have been his most heroic. But if Alec Guinness was the reluctant naval ghost of World War II, then Laurence Olivier was something far stranger, a Shakespearean weapon dressed in khaki, used by the British government to fight Nazis with iambic pentameter. 2 legends down, 11 to go, and the stories only get stranger from here. If you're enjoying the ride through this forgotten chapter of history, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you're listening? Late night? Early morning? We're tracking mysteries across time zones. 3. Sir Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier never stormed a beach or dropped into occupied territory. He didn't parachute behind enemy lines or trade bullets with German patrols. But that doesn't mean he wasn't armed. In fact, by 1944, he may have been the only man in Europe equipped with a government-sanctioned copy of Henry V as a weapon. At the start of World War II, Olivier joined the Fleet Air Arm, the aviation branch of the Royal Navy. It's the kind of detail that shows up in the middle paragraph of a biography, as if naval aviation were just a rite of passage between plays. He trained, served, and flew, but that wasn't where his true wartime impact would lie. That came later, when he was unofficially drafted into the most peculiar battalion in the British war machine, the Ministry of Information's Cultural Division. You see, while men were bleeding out in fields, Whitehall was busy weaponizing narrative. And who better to craft an emotional blitz than Britain's greatest living actor? The answer came in the form of Olivier's Henry V, a Technicolor epic disguised as Shakespeare, financed with government backing and released during the final years of the war as a morale-laced cinematic Trojan horse. It was both propaganda and poetry. Olivier directed and starred, transforming the Battle of Agincourt into a metaphor for the present, for the resilience of Britain in the face of overwhelming odds. And it worked. Henry V became a rallying cry dressed as theater, proof that art could march in lockstep with politics without collapsing under its own idealism. Critics lauded it. Soldiers watched it in field cinemas. It slipped into the bloodstream of wartime Britain with the elegance of a dagger in silk. Olivier himself never claimed the label of war hero. He didn't have to. His performance did the speaking for him. The film became a historical document in its own right, not just of Shakespeare, but of a nation learning to mythologize itself in real time. What Churchill did with speeches, Olivier did with soliloquies. But of course, the truth is never quite as tidy. Behind the scenes, Henry V was a logistical quagmire. Money arguments, artistic clashes, censors, reshoots. And Olivier, for all his brilliance, wasn't a martyr. He was an opportunist, too. Fame and patriotism met halfway. That's war. That's theater. Sometimes they're the same thing. And if Olivier was the bard in arms, then Richard Attenborough was his inverted mirror. Less poetry, more peril. Because while Olivier turned war into cinema, Attenborough climbed into bombers and filmed the real thing. 4. Lord Richard Attenborough. Long before Jurassic Park and Knighthoods, Richard Attenborough's most dangerous role was behind a camera lens, not in front of one. He was young, barely out of adolescence, when he joined the Royal Air Force Film Production Unit. It sounds innocuous, doesn't it? Film unit, like they handed him a clipboard and asked him to document a victory parade. Except RAF film crews didn't hang back in bunkers. They flew. Attenborough was trained to operate on board during bombing runs, camera bolted to his frame, capturing footage of raids from inside the aircraft. These weren't staged shots. There were no retakes. He flew with real crews, over real targets, dodging the same flak and enemy fire as everyone else on board. According to some accounts, the experience left him partially deaf in one ear, a small but permanent reminder that film was, at least in this case, a contact sport. The RAF film unit had a strange dual mandate: make wartime documentaries and survive long enough to edit them. And young Attenborough, with his crisp diction and boyish face, learned very quickly that cinema could kill you. His job was to witness. His weapon was a camera. But the danger? That was very real. Still, despite the risks, and perhaps because of them, he thrived. The footage he helped capture became part of the British War Archive. And after the war, Attenborough transitioned into a screen career with quiet confidence, like a man who had already seen more than most roles would ever demand of him. What's odd is how little attention this chapter of his life gets. You'd think it would be a cornerstone of his public story. Oscar-winning director once flew through enemy fire. But Attenborough rarely foregrounded it. Maybe because the line between soldier and storyteller always felt blurry to him. Maybe because the war had already taken enough people and didn't need another narrator. And yet, the more you look at his post-war filmography, the more that early exposure to risk and sacrifice seems to ripple through his work. There's a moral seriousness beneath the surface, even in the escapism. Attenborough wasn't just pretending to understand war. He had filmed it, frame by frame, from the belly of the beast. But where Attenborough's war left physical scars, Dirk Bogart's left something harder to name. Because his war wasn't about what he saw. It was about what he was allowed to say. 5. Sir Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde was the kind of actor who could say everything without moving a muscle. His face carried secrets. That may be why his real-life wartime role suits him better than most people realize. It was built on silence, analysis, and quiet observation. When war broke out, Bogarde didn't charge into it with dramatic flair. He slipped into it like someone stepping into a second skin. He was commissioned into the Queen's Royal Regiment, later working in intelligence, specifically in the field of photo reconnaissance and target analysis. It sounds like the kind of job that comes with maps, red pencils, and not much else. But in truth, it placed Bogarde in the thick of operational strategy. According to several accounts, he moved through Normandy shortly after D-Day, assigned to gather, interpret, and deliver sensitive intelligence on enemy positions. In practice, this meant going wherever that information lived, often uncomfortably close to the action. Frustrating thing about Bogarde's service is that its most interesting parts are also its least documented. That's the nature of intelligence work. Files are closed, missions are debriefed in whispers. Over time, stories get rewritten, if they're told at all. He once wrote vaguely and hauntingly of seeing things that made it impossible to sleep for years. He never elaborated. That's the closest he got to confessing. It's not hard to understand why. Bogarde was a private man. Even at the height of his fame, he refused to let the press into his personal life. The war, with all its complexity, stayed behind a door he rarely opened. And yet it informed everything: his acting, his writing, the quiet sadness that seemed to linger in his performances long after the cameras stopped rolling. Bogarde never wore his military history like a badge. In fact, he often seemed vaguely irritated by the idea that it should matter at all. Perhaps because he knew firsthand how little heroism has to do with uniforms and medals. Or perhaps because intelligence work, real intelligence work, leaves a person disillusioned with neat narratives. It's not about winning. It's about knowing things no one should have to know. And while Bogarde analyzed war through aerial images, Peter Ustinov was interpreting it from the ground, armed with a pen, a typewriter, and a mind that refused to stop working, even in a battlefield. 6. Sir Peter Ustinov. Peter Ustinov never quite fit into a category. Actor, writer, wit, diplomat, director, polyglot. He wore more hats than the military typically allows. And yet, during World War II, He somehow managed to carve out a space for himself in the British Army, where he did what only Ustinov could, made art in uniform. He served as a private, though his biographers often note that the lines between his duties and his storytelling became comically thin. He was attached to entertainment and script-writing efforts for the military, including working with director Carol Reed and actor David Niven on The Way Ahead, a film that doubled as both propaganda and morale-boosting drama. According to some accounts, he even served as Niven's Batman during this period, a detail that sounds suspiciously like the setup to one of Ustinov's own dry anecdotes. But Ustinov wasn't just scribbling dialogue in the safety of a bunker. His wartime work often involved traveling, staging, performances, coordinating morale-building events, and contributing to the cultural apparatus that kept the war effort emotionally sustainable. In a world falling apart, Ustinov was tasked with putting on a good show. And oddly enough, that show mattered. War tends to privilege violence over voice. But armies still need narratives. Soldiers still need stories, and bureaucracies, especially sprawling wartime bureaucracies, need people who can make sense of chaos. Ustinov excelled at that. Even his military service felt like a rehearsal for the performance of post-war life. Understanding systems, mocking them gently, and using laughter to navigate the absurd. He later reflected on the war with typical irony, once noting that the military had no idea what to do with someone like him. He wasn't wrong. His skill set, fast thinking, creative output, multilingual humor, wasn't exactly in the field manual. But somehow, he found a niche. He wrote, he performed, he documented, he coped. And like so many of his generation, Ustinov emerged from the war with a peculiar mix of reverence and cynicism. He understood the stakes, but refused to glorify them. His career afterward glowed with that same intelligence, the kind of insight only a wartime satirist could develop. But while Ustinov turned chaos into comedy, Kenneth More took a far quieter path, one that involved no spotlight, no scripts, and a Navy that didn't need jokes. Just steady hands and silence. 7. Kenneth More. Kenneth More was never the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. His screen presence, easy, affable, solid, made him the embodiment of mid-century British charm. But decades before he played calm under pressure in Reach for the Sky or A Night to Remember, More lived out that same quiet resolve aboard 2 Royal Navy ships, where charm wasn't currency. Competence was. More served in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve during World War II, a branch often populated by civilians who transformed, abruptly and without ceremony, into wartime officers. It was the kind of transition that fit Moore's unassuming temperament. No theatrics, just duty. He was posted aboard HMS Aurora and later HMS Victorious, ships with real combat histories, not ceremonial backdrops. HMS Aurora was part of the Mediterranean Fleet, escorting convoys and running interference during some of the war's most volatile sea operations. HMS Victorious, one of Britain's few fleet carriers, saw action across multiple theaters. Though the finer details of Moore's assignments remain understated in his biographies, his rank of lieutenant suggests he wasn't simply along for the ride. Naval warfare has no room for dead weight. Moore's post-war stardom, especially his turn as Douglas Bader in Reach for the Sky, often overshadowed his real military past. Audiences saw him portray heroes without knowing they were watching one, and Moore, to his credit, never made a fuss about it. He didn't wear his service like a badge. He let it shape him, quietly, like water shaping stone. There's a peculiar symmetry in Moore's career. He spent the war navigating danger with precision and discipline. Then he spent his acting years portraying men who did the same. But unlike so many actors who chase military roles for the gravitas, Moore brought something intangible to the screen. An ease, a truthfulness, a subtle reminder that he wasn't imagining what it meant to face fear and carry on. And yet, while Moore stayed steady and quiet, Rex Harrison brought his war to the skies. With a pilot's rank, a clipped mustache, and a confidence that barely flinched under pressure. 8. Rex Harrison. To the world, Rex Harrison was always just a bit too composed. On screen, he radiated elegance. Icy, articulate, maybe even a little arrogant. He didn't shout, he insinuated. He didn't chase drama, he conducted it. Which is why it surprises some people to learn that behind that urbane exterior was a wartime RAF officer with a flight lieutenant's commission. Harrison joined the Royal Air Force around 1942. The details of his service are sketched broadly in standard biographies. He trained, served, and earned a rank. A real one, not the honorary kind celebrities sometimes get handed like cocktail invitations. He was in the system, doing his part. The specifics of his RAF duties are less theatrical than his post-war filmography, and maybe that's the point. Not every wartime contribution involves a dogfight or a dramatic mission report. Much of war is logistics, operations, support. The jobs that don't get movies. The kind of roles you have to play without applause. And Harrison wasn't alone in that. World War II's air forces were filled with people doing their best to keep impossible systems from falling apart. Pilots, trainers, liaisons, officers coordinating movement in an environment where a misstep cost lives. If Harrison's screen persona suggested a man in control, maybe it's because he spent part of his life learning exactly what that meant, in real-world conditions. Still, his war service was often reduced to a line or two in biographies, mentioned, then eclipsed by a scandal or a starring role. Unlike other actors who embraced the heroic arc of their military past, Harrison seemed content to let it recede into the background. Perhaps he knew that war stories, when stripped of myth, are often awkward and personal. Or perhaps he just understood that service was something you did, not something you performed. He carried that clarity into his work. In My Fair Lady, he played Professor Higgins with a crisp authority that never needed force. In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, he played an actual ghost, another man stuck between past and present, honor and regret. Maybe he understood those roles a little better than anyone realized. And while Harrison spent his war in the clouds, Michael Redgrave took to the sea, briefly, painfully, and with a story that still floats somewhere between duty and tragedy. 9. Sir Michael Redgrave. Michael Redgrave's life was steeped in performance. On stage, he could transform himself into anything: stern schoolmasters, conflicted heroes, broken men. But offstage, his war record tells a much smaller, sadder story. He did what was asked. He signed up. And then, not long after, he was sent home. Redgrave joined the Royal Navy in July 1941, enlisting as an ordinary seaman. No fanfare, no officer's commission, just a man in uniform doing his part. But the military didn't quite know what to do with him, and his body didn't cooperate for long. By November 1942, barely a year and a half later, he was discharged on medical grounds. The records don't shout about it. Most don't even mention what the specific issue was. And that's the thing. In the grand theatrical epic of World War II, Redgrave's chapter is almost a stage direction. Short, muted, ambiguous. But to understand Redgrave, you have to understand the times. In an era where masculinity was tethered to battlefield survival, medical discharge often carried quiet stigma. Not overt shame, but a lingering sense of having missed something. For a man whose later life was defined by intellectual intensity and emotional complexity, the brevity of his war service may have felt less like failure and more like unfinished business. Yet he did serve. That matters. He left the stage at the height of his rising fame and chose duty, however it turned out. And when he returned, he didn't try to inflate the experience. He let it sit there, understated, in biographies and obituaries, as if to say, yes, I tried. No, I didn't finish. But I was there. His post-war roles took on a deeper gravity, possibly because he didn't need to pretend to understand fear, uncertainty, or the weight of responsibility. He'd already lived with all three. In The Dam Busters, he played an architect of destruction. In the Browning version, a man hollowed out by a life half-lived, audiences saw art. But maybe they were also seeing pieces of a man who once stood in uniform, hoping to matter, and left the service without the clarity of a clean ending. And if Redgrave's war was cut short by frailty, Stuart Granger's was interrupted by something more ironic. A stomach. Because not every soldier's downfall comes with shrapnel or sabotage. Sometimes, it's just an ulcer that writes you out of history's big finale. 10. Stuart Granger. Stuart Granger was born to play the hero. Tall, commanding, impossibly suave, he was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he conquered it. On screen, he fenced, galloped, and romanced his way through a golden era of British adventure films. But during World War II, he was just another face in a khaki crowd, signed up and ready to serve. Granger enlisted early in the war, first with the Gordon Highlanders, a regiment with a long, hard-earned combat history. Not long after, he transferred to the Black Watch, a name that carried weight and myth all its own. There, he earned his commission as a second lieutenant, placing him in the complex hierarchy of British wartime command. For a time, it looked as though Granger's war would be active, dangerous, and lengthy. And then it wasn't. In 1942, he was invalided out of the service due to stomach ulcers, a condition that sounds mundane today, but in wartime was serious enough to end a military career. Just like that, Granger was out. No battle, no scandal, no cinematic exit, just a quiet medical decision that changed the trajectory of his life. What makes Granger's wartime record so interesting isn't what happened. It's what didn't. Audiences, seeing him later as the swashbuckling lead in King Solomon's Mines or The Prisoner of Zenda, naturally assumed he'd lived through similar adventures in real life. His physicality, his clipped authority, his noble bearing, it all screamed combat veteran. But the truth was more pedestrian, more human. And yet, that didn't stop the myth from forming. Over time, people glossed over the ulcer story. They reimagined Granger's war as something more heroic, more action-packed. After all, he looked the part. He played it well. Why shouldn't it be true? But Granger himself never pushed the fiction. He didn't brag. He didn't embellish. Like many of his generation, he understood that the war touched everyone in different ways, some loudly, some quietly, and some through the painful disappointment of not being able to stay. Granger's military career ended before he could make his mark, but perhaps that gave him something just as valuable, the unfulfilled possibility, the sense of having tried, of having been willing, even if fate had other ideas. And for Peter Sellers, the next name on the list, the war wasn't about dashing uniforms or lost potential. It was about performance, which for him was the most serious business of all. 11. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers fought World War II with a punchline in his back pocket and a stage under his boots. Long before the Pink Panther, before Dr. Strangelove, before he fractured the idea of personality into a dozen unforgettable characters, Sellers was a teenager with poor eyesight and a flair for mimicry. Two things the Royal Air Force didn't exactly consider strategic assets. But they found a place for him anyway, and he made it count. Sellers joined the RAF in 1943. He was barely 18, too young to know better, and too nearsighted to fly. So instead of piloting aircraft, he joined the RAF's entertainment division, specifically the Gang Show, a touring review group created to keep morale intact across a war-ravaged military. The Gang Show was part comedy troupe, part traveling therapy. Sellers, ever the chameleon, became one of its rising stars. He performed across the UK and abroad. Accounts mention India, Burma, and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, though the full extent of his touring schedule is murky. Some reports suggest he exaggerated his wartime travels in later years, adding a bit of flair to the already blurry narrative. Sellers was, after all, a man whose whole persona was built on slippery identities. Truth, performance, and memory often blurred into one another. But make no mistake, entertaining troops wasn't just a cushy sideline. These were long tours, grueling schedules, high expectations, and constant movement through unfamiliar, sometimes volatile environments. And unlike the audiences Sellers would later face in smoke-filled clubs or sound stages, these crowds had seen things. Lost friends, carried wounds. Sellers wasn't just performing. He was offering brief, essential relief. It was during these years that he sharpened his uncanny ear for voices and his surgical timing. War didn't just give him an audience, it gave him an edge. He learned what landed and what didn't, what made tired men laugh, what made them forget, if only for a few minutes, where they were. He rarely spoke of the war with gravity. Sellers, like many of his peers, preferred to keep the focus on the work, not the context. But his later career, with its wild tonal shifts and masks within masks, always carried a trace of those early performances. There was an urgency in his comedy, a desperation to transform. As if he'd seen, firsthand, what happened when people couldn't. And just as Sellers toured war zones with sketches and satire, Deborah Kerr brought something very different to the front lines. Poise, presence, and the unmistakable power of a quiet voice in a loud world. 12. Deborah Kerr. In a war where roles were rigid and expectations even more so, Deborah Kerr managed to walk a line few could. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't carry a weapon or fly a plane. But she went to the front all the same, armed with stagecraft, conviction, and an unshakable calm that would become her signature. Born in 1921, Kerr was already building a career in British theater and film when World War II was approaching its final years. But instead of remaining safely within Britain's borders, she joined the efforts of ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. ENSA was Britain's cultural answer to military fatigue, a sprawling organization of performers tasked with bringing theater, music, and morale to Allied troops stationed across Europe. Kerr didn't just tour stages. She toured war zones. She performed for soldiers in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, often shortly after those regions had been cleared of active combat. The conditions were Spartan. The venues, improvised. Audiences ranged from exhausted to wounded to barely attentive. And yet, there she was, luminous, composed, and determined to offer something beautiful to men who had seen far too much of the opposite. This wasn't theater as luxury, it was theater as triage. The timing of her performances, so close to the end of the war, meant she was playing to those carrying the heaviest weight, soldiers nearing burnout, clinging to the hope that it might all be over soon. Kerr's gift wasn't just her talent, but her restraint. She never overplayed the moment. She understood the emotional economy of wartime, how to say just enough without tipping into sentimentality. Later, as she starred in films like The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and From Here to Eternity, Kerr's wartime service quietly echoed beneath the surface. There was a steadiness to her work, a dignity that never felt manufactured. She wasn't acting like someone who'd seen war. She simply had. It's easy to underestimate wartime entertainers, especially women. ENSA wasn't combat service, and Kerr wouldn't have claimed otherwise. But in a world held together by fraying nerves and postponed grief, her presence was its own kind of relief. She didn't need a uniform to make a difference. She just needed a stage. And while Kerr brought grace to chaos, the final name on our list, Honor Blackman, brought something else entirely, a rumor. A war story without a clear source, but too cinematic to disappear. 13. Honor Blackman. Honor Blackman didn't need a war story to seem formidable. She arrived on screen like someone who already knew how to throw a punch. Whether it was judo-flipping villains in The Avengers or out-sassing James Bond in Goldfinger, She gave audiences the sense that she'd done her own stunts and written the instruction manual. So when the rumor started that she'd served as a motorcycle dispatch rider during World War II, no one questioned it. Of course she did. That's what Honor Blackman would do. And yet, nobody seems to know for sure. The claim has floated around for years. You'll find it mentioned in fan pages, shared in social media tributes, whispered in interviews. A teenage Honor Blackman, tearing through British countryside roads on a military motorcycle, carrying urgent messages between bases. An image too perfect to resist. But try to find the service records. Try to locate the unit. Try to pin it down with the same biographical confidence that follows David Niven or Alec Guinness. You won't get far. This isn't to say it didn't happen. Blackman was of age. She was working during the war. The Women's Auxiliary Services absolutely used motorcycle couriers, dispatch riders who risked their lives transporting messages before radios became fully reliable. It was dangerous, unsung, and entirely plausible. But in Blackman's case, the trail goes cold quickly. Most references simply repeat the claim without citation. It becomes fact by repetition, not by record. Why does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. But in a list filled with documented service and archived proof, Blackman's rumored wartime chapter is a reminder of how easily women's histories are lost, softened, or turned into anecdotes. If she served, she didn't talk about it. If she didn't, the myth grew in her silence. Either way, the legend stuck. It fits, though. Blackman spent her life playing characters who refused to explain themselves. Her most iconic roles were women who took up space, kept their secrets, and didn't care what anyone thought about it. Whether she once carried military orders through blackout streets or not, she carried something just as enduring, the aura of someone who could have and wouldn't need to prove it. And maybe that's the best place to end, not with a grand finale or a neat resolution, but with a story left open. A closing mystery. One final question humming in the air, unanswered, just like all the best ones are.